magic and world building.
Yes, Magic Gathering. No, wrong Magic. All right.
World of Warcraft, Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah.
all of the magic and world building things.
Yeah.
He's going to go over the fundamentals of a fleshed out, fantastical world, from gravity to biomes to baking cookies and using the toilet. I don't know if we ever show all those things. Sam will detail what he considers basics for an immersive world. In tandem with this talk will be an explanation of the facets and differences between a soft and hard magic system. This includes gestures, cost, and effect, as well as how to make your magic system complement your world and story. And then after that, there will be time for questions and answers. We do ask that you keep your mic muted if you are not speaking, and then if you have any questions, please dump them in the chat, and then I will have the opportunity to ask Sam those questions at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, so referring back to the going to the bathroom thing, since I'm a writer, I show don't tell, so when we get to that part, I'll show you some YouTube clips. No. So, thanks for having me. My name is Sam Hale. I am a writer and editor. Been doing that since about 2014. And I'm an editor and author and acquisitions dude at Inked and Gray with Dakota. Published short story, novella writer, novelist working on my current novel, which is The Lines of Carthage. And I'm published article writer, done a lot of writing conventions, been on a couple panels. I've also been the creator and organizer of a science fiction and fantasy writing workshop / critique group. I did that for about 3 years. Graduated all kinds of other workshops. And I'm also the producer, editor, and co-host of a podcast called Pod in the Machine, which is a celebration of all things nerds. So we do reviews of stuff like games, film, anime, board games, all kinds of stuff. And we just reviewed the Dugarita, which is a drink that Red Lobster has partnered up with Mountain Dew to make, which is a house margarita with Mountain Dew in it. It's called the Dugarita, and our last pod was on that. I was just editing it, so you can check out our review of the horrifying Dugarita Tuesday, 5 a.m. Central Time, I believe. So, without further ado, Garita, let's get to the world building and magic system stuff. I want to preface by stating that I'll be going off of like the classical epic or high fantasy setting. So your Tolkien-esque portrayals of fantasy. I'm not going to go into all the different niche subcategories there are, but I'm going to also preface that saying you can blend science fiction and fantasy. So even though I'm going to be talking primarily about fantasy, a large amount of what I'm talking about, especially in the world building section, will be applicable to science fiction. A heads up, I have more of a scientific background. Like I have a degree in anthropology. I did a lot of studying of biology, linguistics, archaeology. And as a result, I tend to look at these sorts of things with a very empirical, sense experience way. So if I say certain things that maybe the science is contested or, you might consider just purely hypothetical, just bear with me because this is my school of thought. Also, we do have a time constraint, so there's a lot of stuff specifically in world building that I would love to go over, but I'm going to have to gloss over. So maybe a couple of things you might want to jot down when we get to the Q&A. Most important, though, is that even if you never address certain aspects of your world, the things we're going to talk about, they should still be a known quantity in your head, and we'll get into why that is as we go through things. So without further ado, the origin story, where it all begins. So most fantasy has an origin story. I've read numerous fantasy stories that take place in a single city or a world, but never quite address the origin story. And I like to encourage people to go big when they talk about an origin story, which is to start with the universe itself. And when we talk about that, it can be gradual or sudden. We think about things like the Big Bang. Extremely sudden in the sense that within the first 3 seconds of the Big Bang, the majority of the universe had pretty much come to be. But then afterwards, it becomes a very gradual process, and it might even be something like the oscillating Big Bang theory, where it's starting to, theoretically at least, shrink or kind of rubber band back in on itself. So considering the origin of your universe, also the size of it, some universes are, pretty much on scale with our own, which is to say they're incomprehensible, while other universes are just essentially the equivalent of like a solar system. It's just a couple planets, and really that's their quote unquote universe. Within that, stars are probably the biggest deal because you really can't have any kind of life without stars. It affects all kinds of things, and we'll go into a few of those. The number of planets that are orbiting your planet, as well as celestial bodies, satellites, so things like moons and comets, kind of like we have Halley's comets, sort of things that are that orbit our planet regularly. And you need to factor in those sorts of things, I think, because moons in particular affect things like the planetary bulge that is caused by the orbit of the moon around the planet, which affects things like currents as well as tides, which has an effect on erosion of soil and silt, which has an effect on the shape of the landscape, which So little things become very big. So again, even though it may not be something you bring up in your book, it should still be a known quantity. And just as an aside, with the geological processes that take place, having consistent calamities can be really cool in your world. Something like the fifth season by N.K. Jemisin has essentially like reoccurring volcanic activity. And it is an excellent book because she really did her research and made really fleshed out, interesting, but also incredibly dangerous world to live in. So I highly recommend the fifth season if you want to get some really good world building, especially in terms of geology and plate tectonics. So we zoom in because we go universe, solar system, then we zoom in further. We go to the planet itself. And this is why I say it's important to know that the kinds of suns as well as the number. Assuming you just have like a yellow star like we do, it's just a really boring star actually, but boring's good because boring is consistent, and consistency leads to life. Knowing the number of suns that orbit your planet will help determine the day-night cycle, which is very important because it helps on in the evolutionary sense that you can figure out whether or not your people are diurnal, which human beings are, which means we operate mostly during the daytime, or if we're nocturnal, which is during the nighttime. If you were to zoom in even on the people's daily lives, it also will determine the average workday. We have like a 9-to-5 workday, but if it's on a planet that has, about 8 hours of sunlight total, that's going to affect the workday and what that looks like. It's also going to affect crops and the migration patterns, all kinds of things. So another thing is gravity. It will be affected by the sun or number of suns, as well as your proximity to the sun, which will affect the height of your inhabitants, the arrangement of internal organs, the absence of some. And if you want to get an idea of how a human being can adapt to a zero gravity environment, to kind of use that as a reference point, I'd highly recommend reading the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. And the Expanse itself is a show that got rebooted from the Sci-Fi Network, I believe. And it's a really good show at showing you how gravity affects the way people evolve, even over relatively short periods of time. Some stuff I want to just kind of go over really quick, though, is considering your land formation. I mentioned plate tectonics. It's really important. Another thing is the size of your planet. It tends to be in fantasy that the size of a planet is relatively small. Usually you get kind of the Middle Earth approach, which is almost like this Pangea style of continent. It really is just a supercontinent. And that, I think, is a small world. If you have larger worlds, you need to factor in, how much water is there? And water is going to affect trade. It's also going to affect the wind, which affects the weather and all kinds of things. So factoring in the actual size of your planet, which is something I think kind of goes, some people tend to gloss over. I'm going to gloss over some other things and get into ancient history. And this is, again, just kind of according to your typical fantasy mythos, where usually our story is taking place long after all these amazing beings and creatures have lived and died, and now we're not even quite sure what's fact and what's fiction. So looking at the ancient history, typically, and this is tropish, but trope doesn't really have to be derogatory. Usually the magic is stronger when we talk about ancient history within fantasy. And I think this is pretty cool because it gives us right off the bat a pretty solid metric and benchmark for how to measure the magic maybe a viewpoint character is going to wield throughout the story. So establishing what kind of magic is present in its intensity is a really common theme in ancient history. Additionally is the legends of people and places. are going to affect your story because it's your lore, and that's what people grow up hearing. And what you grow up hearing determines your worldview and how you're going to interact with people, and the way your speech manifests, like the way languages develop over time. And like I mentioned earlier, you will usually have a lot of time spent. Sometimes it's like an interlude chapter, or it's just a little bit at the beginning before each chapter starts with like the history and how people will talk about like what's fact and what's fiction. And that can be really fun and compelling to play with. For example, Troy was a real place. Like Troy, the battle of the Trojans versus the Achaeans actually happened, but the archaeological evidence doesn't suggest there were, gods intervening on behalf of Hector or Achilles. We do have like a gold-plated mask that supposedly belongs to Agamemnon, but we're not quite sure. So it leaves this air of mystery there. There's intrigue. We want to know, like, well, maybe these people are actually real, but maybe they weren't superhuman. They weren't demigods in that sense. So playing with fact and fiction can be really fun. Another thing with ancient history is you have to usually establish what survived, because a lot of the time you'll read a lot of fantasy where there'll be the mechanical crazy structure that defies physics. We don't know why it works. It just works, and we know just enough to maintain it. Like if you read a lot of Warhammer 40K books, they have completely forgotten how to make all the things they used to be able to make. They just know how to maintain them and sort of contract out like piecemeal and make some of these things, but they're like a shadow of their former self. So deciding what survived in technology is really interesting, and doing that with the magic itself. A really important thing, and I'm like an armchair historian at best of times and at worst of times too. A really important thing to consider when you're looking at your history, especially when you go way, way into like deep time, is that the advancement of technology or civilization as a whole, people tend to think of it as this upward trend. And we know for a fact that that's actually not the case, that a lot of civilizations have a rise and a fall, and that has a lot of fallout within that area, and then at a global scale as well. For example, the Roman Empire was incredibly advanced technologically speaking. They could field hundreds of thousands of soldiers in an army in a relatively short period of time. And then after the fall of Rome, even though technically it split, it didn't really kind of fall in the same sense where we use that word. It's a bit of a misnomer. But after it fell, Western European history regressed about 600 years. It wasn't until there was a naval battle in about the 200s BCE, before current events, and the Western European powers weren't able to rival the naval power of the Romans until like 1914, something like that. So it kind of gives you an idea of how we can regress and backslide. Additionally, the Roman aqueducts, Western Europeans just assumed giants built them because they couldn't fathom that normal sized human beings like themselves could build aqueducts of that size, scope, and scale. They just had to assume that giants made them. It was magical in a sense. So this helps just kind of hammer home the fact that civilizations don't always just go up, 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 up. They tend to crash. And when they do, you need to consider how that's going to affect your history. But again, that could be really fun. Let's see, and what was lost too? There's always a lot of lost tech. We'll talk about, the mythical object, or the spell that will get rid of the host of demons that have been plaguing us for thousands of years, but nobody knows where it is, and everybody has theories, and there's archaeological data stating this and that, and maybe it's your viewpoint character's job to go find that and save the day. But those are all really good breadcrumbs. I think that's where all the meat of the story is, to me, is when you tease the reader along and state, like, oh, this strange thing we all know about, but nobody knows the source of it. I go, okay, well, that's an IOU to me as a writer. Now you've put that IOU down on the table. I expect you to fulfill that IOU. Continuing with ancient history, you have to talk about the gods, or the god, or the absence of a god, because this is such a big thing in fantasy, especially because it tends to be like the source of the magic systems in most fantasy books. And ancient history is, I think, probably one of the best times to establish the rituals, the gods, the types of worship, because it is like deep time. Again, we can't separate fact from fiction. I mean, you can have gods that are real in your fantasy book, and that's absolute fact, just like, the sky is blue. But where did they come from? What happened to them? Like, what were their boons and gifts to people? You can play with that. And it's fine to deceive readers as long as you do it in a way that's compelling. And again, if you put that IOU down, you need to fulfill it in some way. But usually usually in fantasy at least, it's polytheistic, which is to say it's multiple gods. In that case too, they tend to exist in a pantheon, which is that they interact, and there's a lot of squabbling, a lot of infighting, especially if you think about the Greek and Roman gods. They were very petty. They were intensely human, which is one of the best parts about them. I think that's why a lot of people find them so intriguing, because they're just such flawed yet powerful individuals. So thinking about that, but this is one thing I wish I would see more of, which is like there are no gods in a fantasy setting. That to me is really compelling, because then you could talk about like, why are there no gods? Maybe that's a big part of your story. The plot that we're going to address is, where did the gods go, or why are there none? That's to me a really compelling storyline. So present day. So now we've zoomed into the people. We're talking about present day. I don't know how many people have seen it, but the remake of Battlestar Galactica was a really good series, because the people in that series start out on 13 different planets. The planets are destroyed. This isn't really spoiling anything. It's like the first hour of the show. Planets are destroyed, and then they just become this giant flotilla, a fleet of ships on this. They're on a pilgrimage of sorts. It's this diaspora. They've been kicked out of the place they're native to. Now they need to find a new home. So it's kind of like Moses wandering through the desert for 40 years. And they find a new home, a new planet, and they live there for so long that the people forget where they actually came from. And that's a really cool idea to me, is rediscovering roots. And I think that's something that's very prevalent right now, and that people could really tap into as far as compelling storylines and backgrounds for your peoples. And the people themselves, your appearance is, again, I'm coming at this from a very scientific point of view, but I know there are all kinds of subversions of this, but the appearance itself is going to be dictated largely by things like gravity, the sun, so forth. Like, it's just a fact that people who live in the southern or northern poles closest to those Arctic regions are pale, because they don't get as much melanin in their skin, and they tend to be very pale. People who live in more equatorial zones tend to have darker skin, so they absorb more of the melanin. Their skin darkens as a result. So you can do that. You can stick to the actual, how things actually played out, and it's interesting and it's scientifically accurate. Or you can do the thing where all of a sudden you have the dwarfs who they live under a mountain, but for some reason they're kind of tan. They are, there's the elves as well, who are pale even though they're out in the sun all day. So you can just play with those things, and that's perfectly fine. I would just say, whatever you do, be consistent about it. So synthesis of language. There's so much to linguistics. There are four schools in American anthropology: biological, linguistic, cultural, and archaeological. And linguistics is the one that has the fewest anthropologists working in it, because the field is so difficult to wrap your head around. That's another way of me saying this is going to be really quick. Language is absolutely tied to how we view the world. For example, American English is very brief. We put a premium on time. Time is money in America. So wasting my time is wasting my money. So we have an economy of words. That's one of the reasons American English has so many contractions, because we just try and blast through the conversation to get to the meat of it, and then we get out. There's a lot of brevity in American English. So when you look at your language, how's it indicative of the culture and the people, the way they've constructed the world around them, whether it's mythological or it's factual? But examples of language, the way they can actually sound, they can be very economic, they can be very flowery, rhythmic, they can be atonal, which is, American English, the fluctuation in the tone of my voice does not affect the meaning of the word. It'll affect the way I might be phrasing it as a question, or I might be shouting something, but putting emphasis in certain parts of the word really only acts to add little stresses here and there. It doesn't change the whole word itself. Or something like Vietnamese, which has, I think it's either 12 or more accents to it. I was learning it at one point. If you say a word with a different kind of intonation at the end, it means a totally different thing now. So you can think about how you want your language to maybe be multitonal. And then you're getting into the Tolkien level of linguistics, which he was super into. And I think he spent years just working on how the Elvish language worked. Things like syllables too. Is your language, again, is it really flowery and extra, or is it just very short and to the point, harsh and guttural? And then also just thinking about, because this is a big one too, is just how you greet people. Like, I've been all over the world, I've traveled a lot, and I've been to a lot of places where, in the places where people didn't greet me, were also the places where people tended to be less polite in general to strangers. But when I went to those places where everybody was saying hi to everybody, it was the complete opposite effect. And total strangers would take me into their house to serve me dinner. I mean, just total strangers. So thinking about how people greet one another is, again, indicative of the culture at large. The city, this is the meat of it, but I am going to have to blast through it. Cities are super duper important. Think about the origin story of your city. Is it a city state? Is it part of an alliance? Is it a confederation? Is it its own sovereign nation, or has it just been essentially a slave state? Like, is it I can't remember the name for it, but Rome did this a lot, where the client states, it's called a client state, where Rome would just have a lot of different countries and kingdoms that they wouldn't directly rule, but if Rome needed people to raise massive armies, they would let you know, and you'd have to raise a levy of 500 people from your area. And if you do that over hundreds of different client states, you can understand how these ancient civilizations were able to raise massive armies in a short period of time. So thinking about that is really important, as well as the neighbors. How well do you get along with your neighbors? Big part of the city's infrastructure. You can tell a lot about a city in the same sense that you can tell a lot about a country by the way they treat their prisoners. You can tell a lot about a city by the way they treat their sewage, which I won't go too deep into it, but sewage is massive. That sounds gross. Sewage is a really big deal because it's all about disease. Like, if you don't take care of your sewage, you will have plagues. Like, the Antonine plague in Roman history was devastating because they weren't taking care of their poop. And there are all kinds of problems with having any sort of septic issues, any sewage that is open air. Aside from the smell, it is incredibly bad for a city. So if you really want to nail down like how well your city's run or isn't, you should show don't tell, but definitely like smell don't tell the sewage problem or lack thereof in your city. I mean, if you want an idea of like an ancient city that handled their sewage really well, you can study a northern Indian ruin site. It's like 5,000 years old. It's called Mohenjo-Daro. And Mohenjo-Daro is one of the first ancient cities that actually had like a sanitation program. They had trash, like people who took out the trash, took care of sewage. They had like some of the first public bathing areas, just like the Romans did, but they preceded them by thousands of years. So you can check out Mohenjo-Daro. It's really interesting too. They have no idea where the people went. It's kind of like Roanoke in the on the east coast of America's early American history, because it's just a mysterious place. The geography of your city is really, really important because it establishes which areas are, you always have a social hierarchy, unless you're writing like a truly egalitarian society, which I have a hard time believing really exists, because I always say like communism's a great idea until you get people involved. It's just people's personal interests always tend to get in the way. So a lot of important cities like Rome and Carthage, all these ancient cities, the major parts where all the power was consolidated, where people made all the big decisions, they tended to be on things called like bursas. A bursa is just kind of like a smaller hill that you would place an important structure on. So where are the things? Are they next to the bursa? Do all the wealthy people actually live next to the harbor? So deciding like what are the most important areas and why are they important? And the outlying districts, what flanks them or surrounds them, why are those areas not important? It just tends to be that you go from like high to middle to low class, and lower class tending to live in the extremities of a city. The untouchables in India, for example, tend to live in just absolute squalor on the outskirts of the city. So that's something to consider. And also walls. I could talk about walls for hours. It is such a massive part of the human story. And there's so much to walls that we typically don't think of. So I would strongly encourage deciding what your walls are like and how well they're maintained, because just like the sewage systems, the maintenance of the walls is going to be very indicative of things. Kind of skip some of the food stuff, but I do want to talk about agriculture. One of the things that establishes the difference, it really delineates the difference between hunter-gatherers and nomadic subsistence farmers from quote unquote a civilization is when people settle down and they start farming. It is one of the first things that archaeologists look for to indicate whether or not a group of people decide to settle down at a certain point. And they'll look at their teeth and see if they have molars that are really ground down from trying to come down on really tough grains, because we have much better ways of breaking that sort of stuff down with technology now. But at the time, they were mashing it mostly with large logs, essentially. So looking at the food's really important. And when you're talking about farming, it almost always comes up, which is slavery. Farming is an incredibly difficult job. And a lot of the times, and this happened in the Americas, in Northern America, at least right up until a little over 100 years ago, a lot of our farming was done by slaves. So considering whether or not you have a form of slavery in your world, is it debt slavery, child labor? Is there sex slaves, things like that? Is slavery inherited, or is it something that can be imposed on somebody for criminal acts? And then additionally, is manumission a possibility? Can people eventually not become slaves? Can they free themselves? And do they do that by marrying into a family? This is very common in ancient Rome, to marry into a family. After you'd served a master for a long time and done really well, they would essentially adopt you, maybe marry you into the family. And then you would no longer be a slave. You'd be what's called a new man. And then you could start your own house, your own lineage, and so forth. So think about that stuff. Most cities, I live in a city that's on an orthogonal plan, which means it's all right angles. It's very hard to get lost in the city I live in. And that's because it's mostly straight lines. Most cities, it's really surprising, a lot of ancient cities are orthogonal in design, whereas a lot of newer cities tend to be slapped together. Like if you go to Rome now, it's not at all sensical. It's bananas what they did out there. I went there with a friend and we were lost perpetually. They changed the street signs sometimes just because it seems like. So is your city just slapdash? I mean, is it put together like that, or is it very rigid and right angles everywhere? That's another way of indicating how well taken care of the city is. And if it has like catacombs, secret entrances, vulnerabilities, stuff like that. A big part of the city too is crime. Crime is awesome, and I would love to talk about it more, but really the meat of it is what kind of crime is allowed. And by that, I mean, what kind of black markets are around? Is prostitution illegal, but essentially legal because the people enforcing the law there, if you have them, are turning a blind eye to it? And that's another good question too, is, and I use Rome a lot because it's such a great example. We know so much. Rome did not have a police force and it did not have firefighters. It's pretty hilarious the things they did to enforce laws, and study that if you want to get an idea of like how ancient civilizations sometimes just kind of did their own thing. They would have a society, they'd have roads, it would be orthogonal, it all made sense, but they had no cops, they had no firefighters, and it's pretty wacky stuff. So think about crime. Do you have crime? And if so, who's enforcing the laws, if at all, and what's legal and what's illegal but is essentially legal, things like that. Governments, this is huge, but again, just don't have the time. So maybe save it for questions. Is it an autocracy or like an oligarchy? Like, do you have a small ruling class, and is it inherited? You can have an amazing king or queen, and there are instances of this across history where somebody is just amazing. They're the next Charlemagne, something like that. But then they have a son who is Nero, essentially, one of the most sadistic rulers in Roman history and world history too. I mean, it's just amazing what he did in just a very short span of time to completely undermine all the progress Rome had been making. So is it an autocracy, oligarchy, things like that? Or is it meritocratic? Like if you look at the Mongols, it's entirely a meritocracy. You earn the right to be in the position you're in. And even if my brother is in a lower position, I can't lift him up. He has to earn that position. And having a meritocracy is a very Darwinian approach. So you want to think about, if you have that kind of society, if you have that kind of world, maybe you should use a meritocracy. So, and then additionally, whatever type of government you use, how do you consolidate power and how is it distributed, if at all? Which means looking at your political climate. Is it in a time of political upheaval? Is this like 1917 Russia, where the Romanovs are about to be overthrown and Lenin is leading the charge with communists? Or is it a pretty stable time? So look at all that stuff. And that's the world building part, but I'm just going to say it over and again. Even if you never address even half the things I just talked about, you should still know them. They don't have to be in your book, but you should know them. Yeah, vassal states, client states. Thank you, complex variable. There's a couple. There is a difference between some of those things. I can't quite remember what it is. I just usually play a lot of strategy games like Total War, and that's how I learn about these things. Anyway, magic systems. I'm going to be pulling heavily from my patron saint of magic, which is Brandon Sanderson. I mean, the guy is he's just such, not only is he prolific, but he's just so good at fleshing out soft and hard magic systems. So I'll be pulling a lot from him, and I'll be pulling from his laws of magic. He has 4 technically, and I just like the first one because I think it sums up the goal of creating a magic system, which is, quote, an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. So these things happen in tandem. They run parallel. Like, we should always know how a situation can be resolved so long as we've been provided with the right context, hopefully some subtlety as well as like proper exposition explaining this is how the magic works, and now we're in a sticky situation, and the reader already starts to do the problem solving, which can be really fulfilling, especially when you come up with the same solution that the viewpoint character might come up with. Usually, if it starts to become very predictable, then maybe you've got a problem there. But I go through 2 magic systems here. I go through the soft and hard, but I would encourage people to think about them on a spectrum, which is to say you can have strict hard magic elements, like the cost and the ingredients required to make a fireball are always the same, but maybe the effect of the fireball tends to waffle. It does things sometimes and it doesn't other times. So you could have some softer elements to it that maybe you never address. Like, that's totally fine. Whatever your logic is, you just have to be consistent with it. So don't make the fireball do this and then don't do this, and all of a sudden it starts consistently doing this for the rest of the book. It deviates from the logic you've created. So think about magic on a spectrum instead of saying, well, there are these 2 camps and you're in this one and you're not in that, and vice versa. That's a very binary way of looking at how magic, I mean, it's fantasy. Just do whatever you want. It's fantastical. So I'm going to start with soft magic systems, and full disclosure, I prefer hard magic systems. I don't have beef with soft magic, but it's just not what I tend to write. So I'm going to do my best to portray soft magic in a positive light here. And the way I do that is by considering soft magic as something that's mysterious. The subtlety and the things not explained don't take away from it. They add to the mystery. And again, soft is just a misnomer to me. It's soft in the sense that it's not a hard empirical science, but it has a logic all its own. It's just not as observable. It's not as apparent to us. Whatever the logic is, you just have to stick to it. And you get to decide, too, how evident the magic is. You get to decide what you show us and what you tell us, and that's totally cool. Again, just stick with your logic. Within soft magic systems, I think this is the biggest strength of soft magic system, is anything is possible. Like, you can do anything so long as you provide a reasonable-ish explanation for it. Because the best part of going with the soft is that you have a sense of wonder. It's magical. Like, it's really that Tolkien-esque magic that we don't really know what Gandalf can do at all times. Sometimes there are some explanations in later works, but for the most part, like, what Gandalf can actually do is just very abstract and ethereal. We're never quite sure what it is, and that's totally fine because it adds to that sense of wonder there. Just don't break your rules unless you've got a great plot twist in mind. Like, if you break a rule that has been established through 2 of your 3 books and all of a sudden it's no longer working, as long as you lay down story breadcrumbs, I'm with you. I want to know why that is. So you can break your own rules so long as you've got a good enough reason to do that. I would caution people using soft magic systems, though. They are far more likely to be a crutch than a hard magic system. And that's because they are a bit more abstract. Like, the whole skeletal structure isn't there for you to observe. Like, some of it you understand how it works, some of it you don't, and you just have to go with the flow. But as a soft magic system writer, you need to be careful that you don't let it become a crutch, or, the popular quote is, a wizard did it. Like, anytime there's a problem, a wizard did it. He saved the day, a wizard did it. There is a problem, a wizard did it. And it's kind of like Gandalf coming to save the day, he's like, look to the third day to the east and the fifth star, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, it is kind of a Deus Ex Machina, but it's so fulfilling. We don't mind that, like, Gandalf and his army that he's pulled out of nowhere just come rushing down, take care of all the orcs, and save the day. It's done so well that it's awesome. Whether you're reading the book or watching the film, it's amazingly well done. But I think if you tried to do stuff like that, sometimes now people might just say, "Oh, it's a Deus Ex Machina. It's not fulfilling." So just being really careful when you do stuff like that. But I think a soft magic system is great for developing tension, drama, and conflict because it doesn't have the same restrictions that a hard magic system does. Again, it has that sense of wonder to it. For me, it channels the inexplicable nature of the universe. And I know that sounds really frou-frou, but like it's really humbling. You get to be humbled alongside the character because you don't understand how certain things work. So when something just truly magical happens, it's awesome. Like in the real sense of the word, awesome. Like it evokes awe within the reader. And you don't have to explain stuff so long as it's fulfilling, interesting, and just compelling to us. Civilization series, great. Go Sid Meier. Ars Technica has a really good interview series with him as well. This is on using viewpoint magic users, viewpoint characters who are magic users in soft magic, which is they don't have to understand how the magic works. I would strongly discourage you from just telling us how all the magic works. I would just say in general, don't ever do that. But that's why the farm kid who has a little flicker of magical potential gets discovered by the old wizard and is taken to the magical school. That's a really common trope because it's a good way to establish growth over time. We get to see and understand the magic in tandem with the viewpoint character. Like I said earlier, when you're talking about ancient magic and how it establishes precedent, it's that magical benchmark. It helps us understand where we are in relation to the pinnacles of the magic within your world. So having a viewpoint magic user can be really, really fulfilling. And I mean, reading stuff like Name of the Wind with Kavoth, he's an excellent example of a semi-soft, semi-hard magic system that it's understood to a certain extent, but there's a lot of mystery there. But the sense of growth you get from reading about Kavoth and how he over time starts to master the magic is so fulfilling. Multiple magic systems. Let's see. This one I would apply to hard and soft magic systems, honestly, which is that multiple magic systems allow for more diversity. The caveat being they're so much harder to write about because as somebody who's been writing a hard magic system for a while now, over a year, just one magic system, let's say you have like 5 interacting elements to your magic system. I suck at math, so I'm not going to do it. But if you had 5 different all interacting things, like earth, fire, air, water, heart, whatever it is, and they all have different levels of interaction, different combinations, can be 3 versus 1, 2 versus 2, whatever it is. If you actually break down, like you extrapolate all the different variances that are capable with just 5 elements of a magic system, it's massive. So if you decide to add, stack up multiple magic systems on top of that, you've just added a ton of work and a lot more rock, paper, scissor to your magic system that can be incredibly well done. Like if you read the Mistborn series by Sanderson, I think it has 2, I can't remember, it's 2 or 3. It has 2 for sure. Actually, I think it has 3 magic systems. They all interact, they all have their own rules, and they have rules specific to when they interact. It's incredibly cool. It's super fulfilling because when you get to the 3rd book out of 3, all that buildup and how those magic systems interact when you finally get to it, every other chapter is a revelation in the 3rd Mistborn book. It's so fulfilling because that sense of wonder with the magic system is there. All the groundwork, the foundation for it's been done. So once we start to see why things are interacting the way they are in a mysterious manner, it's so gratifying. That's really, for me, that's the sense of wonder that magic can provide. So adding multiple magic systems, I would just caution anybody, if you're pretty new to writing and specifically creating magic systems, maybe start with one and see how it goes, and then start stacking them up if you start to feel pretty comfortable with that. But it does really provide kind of like exponential growth in terms of creativity. So I wouldn't tell anyone not to do it right off the bat, but just know that you're really, you're going to be in for quite a challenge. Let's see. The soft magic system, sense of wonder in tandem with world building. This goes for all of them, but really they should all be interacting at the same time. Like none of these elements are autonomous from one another. Your magic should never be separate from the world. Creatures adapt in a certain way because of the natural environment. And then over time, those creatures start to affect the environment as well, which has an effect on the creatures. And you start to see that chicken and egg kind of relationship going on. And you should just make sure that your magic system is always interacting with the world and vice versa. They should never exist in a vacuum. I would say that's about it for soft magic systems. The one tricky thing, though, I will say about soft magic systems is your source of magic, if you're not careful, can also just feel very shoehorned. It really can just feel like it's a crutch. Like it doesn't come to you in a fulfilling way. It doesn't always feel like, well, that's a reasonable explanation. Whatever happens afterwards, I'm cool with. So I would just caution you to do a lot of research into where your magic comes from. And by research, I mean like study ancient history. I can't tell you how much inspiration I've gotten just from reading ancient history. It has blown my mind, the amount of stuff that is just buried in these old books. And if you ever say you're out of ideas, that's total crap. You need to crack open a book and read some of the things that happened just 2,000-3,000 years ago. It'll blow your mind. Hard magic systems. Well, this is pretty much my bread and butter. I'm not going to lie. I've got more notes for this one than I do soft magic. I think of hard magic systems as being scientific. They're like the scientific method. The rules are clear, ... most of the time. We know what the characters can or cannot do most of the time. And if we don't know why something is happening, that should be a story breadcrumb that later on you've written an IOU that you will fulfill later on. But in general, hard magic system, to me, it's A plus B equals C 99% of the time. And when it doesn't, that's a story element. It's a scientific method of magic, barring things like wild magic or other factors, which again are just great breadcrumbs for you. Characters not knowing the rules of the magic system are opportunities to explain it. So your viewpoint magic user messes up and almost burns their hand trying to cast that fireball. Why did that happen? What do you do to prevent that in the future? Those are all excellent opportunities. So have your characters make mistakes, because having a magical savant is such a trope. That's a trope I think just needs to disappear entirely. Like the savant is not a fulfilling plot line anymore, especially when they're just the farm kid with no previous experience. All the best epic fantasy I've been reading lately, especially from guys like Brent Weeks, the kids are talented with magic, but they're not savants. The young boys, young girls, they have the capacity, but they still don't know anything about it. And they're not god level magic users. They're pretty good, but they still have a ton of training to do. They still make a ton of mistakes. People get hurt. Some people die. So have your characters make mistakes with a soft or hard magic system for that matter. With a hard magic system, though, consequences are a really big deal, because magic in a hard magic system, it has to have a cost. And you don't have to, but you really should. I mean, you have to. Consequences need to be really clear. If there's a type of magic system where every time I cast a spell, I lose a digit, like I lose a finger or I lose a toe, that has a huge effect on when and how I use my magic. Like those are pretty extreme situations where I'm like, okay, I'm going to use the fireball, but I'm down to 2 toes now. That's going to have a huge effect on why your character does or doesn't use magic in the future. So establishing why the cost is clear is essential. Breaking the rules has a cost. Using magic has a cost. Not using magic may have a cost too. Maybe it's a type of magic system that is just constantly building up and just getting ready to boil over the pot, and that this species has to constantly be using magic to diminish that boiling pot inside of them. And if they don't, maybe they explode. Who knows what kind of, they turn into a demon, something like that. So you can have magic systems where not using it is detrimental. And so how do they exist in concert with one another if you have 1,000 people in a village all just constantly using magic or dissipating heat? Because if they don't use the fireball, they're gonna blow up and light all the houses on fire. So thinking about how not using magic is going to have a cost as well. Limitations are very clear. The magic is clearly defined. It's replicable. It's quantifiable. it's the scientific method of magic. If you give me all of the ingredients you used to make a fireball, I should be able to take all those ingredients, assuming we're of the same skill level. You know, we're like sophomore level wizards. You give me all the same ingredients you used to make a fireball, I should be able to reproduce that fireball to the same degree and effect that you did. That's how I think about hard magic. Is it's the scientific method. It has like a hypothesis. We go over the method, we test our hypothesis, we go over the results, and then we look at it. Like, if you really want to make sure you've got a balanced hard magic system, step back and look at, like, if two strangers are able to do it and produce the same exact results, and you've probably got a pretty consistent system going on. And kind of like I mentioned earlier at the top with Sanderson's first law, hard magic systems are almost always used to great effect when solving problems, whether it's a puzzle or a sticky situation with bandits surrounding them. Character growth occurs alongside the mastery of the magic. So using problem solving is a really good way to establish a metric or a unit for growth. Like, we know that maybe your character was in that same situation 10 years ago before they went to magic school and they got the crap kicked out of them. Now they're in the same situation 10 years later and they're the one kicking the crap out of everybody else. That'll establish a metric for growth, and it's problem solving too. You know, you could probably find less violent ways to do it than I just did, but problem solving is a really, really big deal with magic systems, hard magic systems. And readers get to grow again with your character in ability and understanding. They can start solving problems in the same way. Like, if you read the Da Vinci Code, and you can say what you want about Dan Brown, but the guy knows pacing and he knows how to gratify a reader. Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code is a really gratifying read because you are always able to solve the problem about one paragraph or like one page before the main character does. And it's so gratifying because you feel smart. You're like, oh yeah, I'm smarter than the pro tech. You're not. Dan Brown just made you feel like you were. He knows what he's doing. He's dangling the carrot in front of you, and you're just constantly going for it, trying to take a bite out of it. And sometimes you get it, and you're like, yeah, I got the carrot. He's like, no, I let you have the carrot. So making your reader feel like everything that's happening is just the way they would do it themselves, or they're solving problems and going like, oh yeah, that's perfect. I knew what I was doing. That's really gratifying. That's a great way to utilize a magic system, a hard magic system, though you could use that for the soft one as well. The weaknesses are really big for hard magic systems. If you think about Avatar: The Last Airbender, it's just a great example of like a middle ground between soft and hard magic systems. It's very clear about weaknesses. Like, certain elements are very useful in certain situations. In Avatar, there's earth, fire, air, and water. People are called benders. They manipulate these different elements to different effects. But a firebender is useless when they're swimming in the ocean, whereas a waterbender is exceptionally powerful when they're just surrounded by water. Vice versa, maybe we're in the desert, firebender is able to channel that heat and use it to greater effect, whereas a waterbender in the middle of the desert is totally screwed. So understanding the limitations as well as the weaknesses are really going to help your reader go like, oh, okay, that's how this thing works. Other weaknesses, though, aside from environment, is the weather itself. I'm reading a book where weather is a part of the magic system, and I find it really interesting. It's not a huge part, but it is. Ingredients, if you're doing more like an alchemical approach, you got to have certain ingredients to use certain kinds of magic. And again, like the Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss does a great job of adding an alchemical touch to the magic. And the part about how limited the magic is, or the weakness is, yes, there's the magical reason it's weak, but there's also the economic reason, which is that Kavoth, the main character in the Name of the Wind, he's just perpetually broke. Like, he is always poor because he uses his money to get ahead in the school or to just survive. And as a result, like, for him, one of the weaknesses in his magic is that he can't afford the ingredients to use it. And a lot of the time it's comedic. Like, it's actually really fun, but Rothfuss is really smart in that he establishes these peaks and valleys you're constantly going through with the character as he tries to navigate a hard magic system, you know, kind of middle ground, but like a hard magic system that has economic weaknesses or restraints to it. Additionally, the ingredients, maybe they need to be pure, or maybe they need to be impure. Like, you need to find a certain kind of flower that absolutely, like hemlock, it will kill somebody if they ingest a drop of it. Maybe you need something that's very scarce or rare. Again, things that are expensive, stuff like that. And the money aspect is a great way to world build too. Like, why is this element so expensive? Well, it's because 1,000 years ago, blah, 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 blah. So think about that. But a big part of limitations and weaknesses the magic system should be other magic systems or other elements of your magic system. It's like playing rock, paper, scissors or a game of chess. There are always ways to cancel out other magic systems. There should never be like an omnipotent magic system that just has no inherent weakness to it. It's so bland, it's so boring. Like, I would just absolutely, that's a book burner for me. Like, because how are you going to overcome that? You're going to have to essentially write like some Deus Ex Machina kind of stuff, where somebody's just going to come along and accidentally bump into the super powerful dark wizard and knock him into a vat of acid. Like, it's stupid. So don't just, magic should always have a counter. You know, it's like I studied martial arts. Every move had a counter. There was always a way out. So think about that. And what allows your characters to use the magic, for how long, and to what degree. This one is where you start to get a little soft, because you know sometimes the fireball, like, everybody can cast it, but it's more powerful with certain people and it isn't with others. That's fine. Like, that to me, when you kind of traipse back into that softer level of magic, like, I don't really have a problem with that. But establishing like how long somebody can use magic is important. Like, if I try and use the fireball, and instead of a fireball I just try and shoot like straight up flames out of my hand, that should have a much higher effect or a higher cost than just using a fireball, because I've concentrated it. I'm channeling a ton of heat within my body to fuel it. And like, if you read The Name of the Wind, when Kavoth does stuff like this, he's left, you know, hypothermic, because he's used all of his body heat to make a flame. So how does somebody use the magic, and for how long, and to what degree is very important. Style, last thing. This is where you get to just like put your own touch on it, like make it look cool. Avatar: The Last Bender is amazing, especially if you've studied martial arts, when you realize that every element being used is based off of actual real world martial arts. Especially like waterbending is based largely on Tai Chi, which I studied. And when you understand it and you get to see it being used, you're like, oh, I know that's petting the horse's mane. Like, it's really gratifying stuff. So thinking about like, how do you want people to use your magic? Is there the incantation? There's the gesture. If you watch like, what is it, like Naruto, where they've got this jutsu, like they have to make all these very specific hand gestures in order to use the magic. And if they don't do it, it can be disastrous. So what kind of gestures are involved, if at all? I've always thought it'd be kind of interesting to just have like, you'd have to be pretty strong with internal dialogue at least to do this, where you just had magic users battling each other, but they weren't making a move, they weren't blanking or anything. It was just entirely in their head. That would be kind of interesting, but you'd have to still essentially create like a mental physical space in that regard. So you'd still have a way to conveying like the weight, the movement, the gravitas of actions within that mental magical space. But think about your style and just make sure it's consistent. Like, if I always have to like twiddle my pinky before the fireball comes out, it should always be my pinky. If all of a sudden it's my thumb, then the reader who's been reading your books for however long is going to go, why is it their thumb now? It's always been the pinky. So think about your style. And think about, again, world building and magic happens in tandem. I haven't read a good fantasy book where they didn't make the two absolutely essential to one and the other. Like the magic, you know, there's always like calamitous magic events that cause that massive crater where the magic is extra powerful, but it's so powerful it's almost poisonous. Or massive mountain ranges that were formed by this epic battle between the ultimate good guy and the ultimate bad guy, like stuff like that. This should happen in tandem, because that's good world building and that's good magic building, whatever you want to say. And just again, if you never address these things in your story, you should still know them. They should be a known quantity. I didn't touch on making cookies. I didn't have time for it, but I consider what the cookies look like and what the size are in my world, and it is based off my magic system. I know what the cookies are going to look like, and that to me is when I know I've fleshed things out fully enough. It's like, oh yeah, my cookies are going to look like this. And if you know what your cookies look like, you've got a good story in your hands. So that's it. Q&A.
All right. Does anybody have any questions for Sam. What does the cookie mean in this context?
I wish there was subtext, but it's actually just a cookie. Like when you're cooking at when you're baking at higher elevations, it affects the amount of time that you bake things for. And I use that kind of as a way to explain how knowing how a cookie is going to be made, because if you're living in a magical world, there's probably a way you could use the magic to bake cookies. And if you can figure out a way to bake cookies using your magic system, or something really niche, like just how would you clean a room just using your magic system in a way that doesn't tear the carpet out of the floor or like blow a wall down? Like, could you do that? And if you couldn't, could you explain to me in a sufficient way why that's the case? So when I say cookie, I really just do mean cookie. Like, how would you do something totally mundane using your magic system?
I guess, Anne, I'll ask a compliment question. What's the benefit to that? Why is that cookie theory important?
Cookie theory is important, I think, because, and this happens all the time when I'm writing, I will change the way somebody answers a question or the way I write narrative just because I know how cookies work. It's a little subtext kind of thing. Like you're all the more informed on your world. And it causes you to add certain things that are really nuanced and small that you might not have otherwise. And it also prevents you from putting things down on the page that you might not have in the first place. You just think like, well, you know what? I know how cookies are made in this world, so I don't really feel like I need to go too deep into that because I think I've explained it sufficiently, the ways that the reader could pick up on.
Cool. I think we have another question popping up. Can you talk about using artifacts with hard fantasy?
My experience has always been that they augment or amplify.
Or hard magic, my bad. Sorry.
Using artifacts with hard magic. Yeah, I mean, kind of the same thing. They almost always act in a way to augment / amplify things. They give it a little extra juice. Sometimes, though, it is the, it's the MacGuffin we've been charging after this whole book. And maybe we were the magic we needed the whole time. It was right inside my heart. But usually when we get like a hold of some kind of artifact, it is always in a way that really, usually like the artifact can be inserted in two different ways, which is early on in a mysterious way that's really unreliable, really unpredictable. Even in a hard magic system, that's great because it's breadcrumbing. So it can be early on and we don't know how it works. And over your series or your book, whatever it is, we're going to learn how to utilize it. Or it can be the artifact that at the end of the story, we've been looking for this thing for 300 pages. You've built up this whole cadre of friends and companions who are all helping you find this thing, and you finally do, and it's the key to unlocking the tomb where the thing is, or to stopping the bad guy. Like, I think artifacts, you just have to be really careful. In the same way with soft magic systems, you just have to be really careful that it doesn't solve all your problems. Like, I was reading a book pretty recently, maybe like a year ago, where they got the artifact and it just didn't do anything. It was just broken. And it was up to the main character to figure out. It was kind of like the power has always been inside you moment. But I was okay with that because the writer had done all the work to prove that the power was inside of the main character. So when we got to that moment and it was just broken, this artifact was totally useless and it was just a paperweight, I thought it was kind of funny and it was kind of great because it was a fun subversion of expectations. And I love that because fantasy is so troped out, and that's not always a bad thing. I mean, it's really hard to write fresh fantasy now because it exists based on so much mythology. I mean, there are elements of Gilgamesh, a 5,000-year-old story that we're still using today. Like the hero's journey emerged with stories like Gilgamesh. So it's really hard to write fresh fantasy. So when all of a sudden the artifact we've been chasing after that we assumed is going to solve all of our problems just is a piece of crap, that's really fun and interesting to me. I like reading those kinds of things. So I would encourage, if you have the artifact, maybe it does save the day, but maybe not in the way we expect it. It shouldn't just be like I hold it up in the air above me, I shout really loud into the wind, and then all of a sudden all the power is unleashed. And that sort of stuff is a little too Hollywood for me. Especially, I mean, if it's a hard magic system, it should be like a puzzle. Like it's this hyper faceted crystal that is, it's like trying to play 9-dimensional chess upside down while holding your breath in zero gravity or something. It should just be so difficult. Like, but you should have done all the work ahead of time so that when we get to that puzzle, like the character has that moment where they finally go, I know how to solve the puzzle. And they've been trying to solve the puzzle over and over throughout the whole book and having try-fail cycles. And they finally get to that final moment. They go, I know what to do. And it's actually usually a really simple solution. It's like Occam's razor. Simplest solution tends to be the correct one. So, good question. I have more world building stuff, but I don't want to drag this out. So if you guys want more world building, I can talk about that, or we can do some Q&A. I can just talk magic too. Oh, this is a great question.
Yes. What about the use of drugs or psychedelics?
I just...
We were just talking about this yesterday.
And I decided to add psychotropics to my story because there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests, especially with the ancient Greeks, that hallucinogens were used to kind of contact the other side. And I think there's absolutely a place for it. I would give the same advice that I would give to somebody who decides to do it in the real world, which is if your character's trying to do a psychedelic or some sort of drug, the setting is immensely important. And so one way to ensure a certain kind of result is to create the right or wrong setting, especially with psychedelics in general, because they tend to last longer, unless it's, like, well, I don't even get into it, but I don't know any of these things, but this is all just what I've read. But the use of psychedelics, I think, is really cool. Another thing that I think would be really interesting is, kind of like tied to the idea of artifacts amplifying things. How does magic amplify certain aspects? I'm sorry, how would a drug or psychedelic amplify magic powers? But what's the drawback? Because a lot, like if you play a lot of video games, you can do the thing where you take like the syringe of adrenaline and just shove it into your veins, and all of a sudden you're able to run faster, you can dodge faster, do more damage, all kinds of stuff. But I'm playing a game called Remnant from the Ashes, and I've seen this thing over and over in games, but you can do the adrenaline shot and it's awesome. But the thing that sucks about Remnant is it has no cost. Like, you just do it and it's fine. I hate that. I kind of hate that. I want to know that if I'm going to go do a shot of some hyper hallucinogenic drug that is going to make it so I can do like 20 fireballs, I need to know that there's something to it that's going to have a huge detriment. Like, it should be directly proportionate, just the same way Sanderson's first law's understanding is directly proportionate to our ability to solve problems. Like, a drug or some sort of external influence should have a directly proportionate response to using that drug or whatever it is. That being said, I mean, when you're talking about with magic, a lot of people just rely on the magic itself to go into those altered states. But I think it'd be really interesting to see how they work in concert. And in a way, you could almost create like a separate magic system using those hallucinogens or drugs in a way that does augment the magic system, or it is its own, or it's an alchemical thing. Yeah, the Marines and StarCraft, that's exactly it. Like, everything, I mean, if you're doing a hard magic system, it has to have cost. I kind of waffle a little bit about it, saying you don't have to, but you have to. Like, a hard magic system, one of the basic principles is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It's Newtonian physics translated into magic. You have to have it. It's so unfulfilling when it's not there. That's why I hated in Remnant, I can use as much adrenaline as I want. And the only cost really is the economic cost. Just like with Kavoth affording elements to use magic in the Name of the Wind. But there's no real economic struggle in Remnant. I mean, you're able to afford those things relatively early on, and you can just buy tons of them. So your drugs should definitely have a cost. They could have an actual economic, monetary cost to them. And I mean, just like with actual psychotropics, I mean, they have a cost. Like, you don't do a bunch of psilocybin and then go run a 20-mile marathon. Like, you're usually conked out, I assume. I have no idea. But, with these heavier drugs, you can think about what happens to people who do a bunch of heroin, become addicted. their body become like the actual biological structure kind of rewrites itself to accommodate the sudden influx of drugs. Same thing with alcohol. I have a family that has an extended family with alcohol abuse, and I had an uncle whose body completely changed to accommodate massive amounts of alcohol. And if you're going to have drugs in your system, seeing how the characters acclimate to them or adapt over time, that to me is really compelling, because as somebody who understands substance abuse from a removed position, at least, that's really compelling to me. Like, if you want to tell a real story, one that's got some really grounded stuff, and that tends to be the hard magics world, that's really cool to me. You have a drug that's really powerful, does all these things, but it is completely ruining society. And it's kind of like the spice in Dune by Frank Herbert. Like, the spice is immensely potent. But it's really cheap. Like, it's easy to come by if you're willing to take certain risks and live out in the desert with the Fremen and stuff like that. But the spice is incredibly potent. It allows space travel. Like, that's why they, kind of preface the entire story with like, the spice must flow because here's all the things the spice can do, and people get, they get addicted to the spice. Yeah, it's the spice, man. Like, but how does using a bunch of drugs to alter somebody's appearance, just like the spice turns people's eyes blue? Paul Atreides becomes, semi-prophetic. He can kind of divine the future to a certain aspect, or all the possibilities, and kind of suss them out. So that's a long-winded way of saying, like, drugs are great in fantasy. Don't do drugs. I mean, just read about them, because we're writers. We just read about drugs. We don't actually do them.
I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to say that this concludes the Magic and World Building panel. Thank you, Sam, for coming out and hanging out with us and talking about all things magic and world building. If you would like to track Sam down, I'm going to
some stuff, right?
Yes, I was going to copy and paste your Twitter handle if you have anything else that you'd like to share.
I do. Yeah, so obviously I'm pushing my product here, which is, if you are into hard magic systems, soft magic systems, check out the podcast, Pod in the Machine. It's a celebration of all things nerd. When we're not drinking Dugaritas, we're actually talking about real nerdy things, upcoming films, tech, anything like that. It's a lot of fun. It's a comedy podcast about nerd stuff. It's myself and a friend of mine since we've been 14, Dale Washington. Obviously, check out Inked and Gray at our Twitter as well, because we talk a lot about different kinds of stories and different groups of people from mental illness to people who are living like in, being held down in certain ways, lifting those voices up, getting them out there. So check us out on Twitter. And then I posted Brandon Sanderson's, the link to his first law, which segues into the second and third, as well as his, quote, 0th law, which is like the 4th one. So that's a really great source. And if you want to, Brandon Sanderson he's part of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and this isn't an endorsement for any of this. He just wants to give back. So all of his fantasy writing, essentially sci-fi fantasy writing classes that he teaches at BYU, at Brigham Young, they're entirely free on YouTube. He does not charge for them. You're getting a world-class education in fantasy writing, world building, all that stuff, totally free. And he posts, like, every year he's been teaching, he posts the entire thing on there. So you can get a world-class education from Brandon Sanderson for free on YouTube. I would watch all of them, take notes, just treat it like homework. Like, once every night, once a week or something, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do the homework he gave the actual class. Just check it out. They're great. But I'm on Twitter too, but just go listen to the podcast. It's awesome.
It is, and I think the newest one either just came out or is out shortly.
Yeah, we just did talk about the 80s and 90s films that are being revived, especially stuff like Cobra Kai, those sorts of things. And we talk about mecha. Eric, thank you so much for subscribing. We talk about mechs. We talk about tropes. Like, we have a number of podcasts, because it started out as a trope podcast, and then we kind of the script a little bit. So we talk about game reviews. I did review Remnant, stuff like that. So if you're into indie gaming in particular, I am a huge indie game developer fan. I would love to be a developer someday. So check it out. Like we love hearing from people too. We want ideas from you guys, and we want to not always have to drink Dugaritas. So please give us advice on other things to drink that aren't absolute nightmares in a cup.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Don't do
Always.
drugs. Yeah, only characters do drugs. Yeah. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. It's always nice to talk to everyone and just get some ideas too. Talking to you gives me ideas. Makes me want to go to my story and start adding stuff I hadn't thought of. So thank you.